Hello, this is the episode 2, and today we are continuing the other part. We understand a little about warfare in the Mayan words, and from inspiration, it seems the Maya often added over to low-level skirmishes and raids, and these small wars, known as axe wars, serve a ceremonial and even a symbolic function. They may have involved perhaps a few hundred fighters, and their purpose was to capture prisoners for religious sacrifice, perhaps to decapitate an important noble, and presumably to bring back plunder to the capital. But occasionally, a different kind of war was undertaken that had a more brutal and all-encompassing nature. These wars were also referred to in inscriptions as Star Wars, the name coming from a specific type of glyph used in the Maya script, which depict a star showering the earth with fire. These kind of conflicts are rare in the Mayan world, but whenever they occur, they radically rebalance power in the lowlands. These were wars of total conquest. According to the interpretations of certain difficult inscriptions, it appeared that in 556 CE, the king of the Red City of Tikal, Double Bear, embarked on an axe war against his former ally, the city of Karakol. The Karakol had until recently been one of Tikal vassal or clan cities, likely supplying food and tribute soldiers and workers. Double Bear's reason for ordering the attack are unclear. It could have been punishment for some insult or failure to pay tribute, or because Tikal feared that it was falling under the influence of Calakmul and wanted to remind it who was in charge. Whatever the reason, Karakol's leaders didn't take the axe war in good humor. In retaliation, they announced the beginning of a true war, a star war, against their former master in Tikar. We can assume that Calakmul gave every help it could to these insurgents, and in 562 Tikal was overwhelmed and its enemies swept into the city. The historian David Drew described the scenes, and he said, "Today we can reconstruct in outline what very probably happened. In 562, Tikal's enemies overran the city. They smashed and burned monuments and shrines, uprooted stones tall and broke them to pieces, discarding or burying the fragments. Archaeologists have found human bones, jade ornaments, catches of obsidian, and fine pottery from temples and tombs on the North Acropolis scattered about and stuffed into nearby or underground store chambers. The perpetrators of this conclave set out to humiliate Tikal, to insult the memory of the royal dynasty they had defeated, and very profoundly took away and trimmed some of these portable and holy images. For the next century, Tikal's population stopped growing. No stone carving or public monuments were erected. Its people were buried with only meager possessions, and production of painted pottery ground to a halt. The fate of King Double Bear is unknown. He was probably taken back to Karakol or Calakmul and executed at the top of a pyramid. A new king was put in place in Tikal, known as Animal Skull, and although we know almost nothing about him, his tomb inscriptions show that he was not the son of Double Bear. For the next century, Calakmul and not Tikal would rule the Yucatan, and this Mayan rivalry would grind on for generations, with one side regaining the upper hand only to lose it again. In the end, it wasn't war that caused the collapse of the Mayan world. At last, not entirely, it was to get to the root causes of this collapse. We need to look at the way that the complex interconnected web of Mayan society arranged itself, the fatal flaws built into its structures, and the tensions and conflicts that would ultimately tear it apart. And then from 800 onwards, all across the Mayan lowland, the signal of these inscriptions grow weak, falter, and then died out completely. Its cities fell silent on one side, like lights blinking out in the dark. The collapse first took hold in the southwest, uh, along the Usamascinta River. At the city of Bonampak, the last dated inscription is from 792. The city of Yakitan stopped carving in 808, and from there, this wave of doom washed over the Mayan lowlands. The great snake city of Calakmul fell silent after 810, and Copan in 822. Tikal held out for another 70 years after the fall of its rival, but it took finally succumbed to the silence in 889. The last classic Maya inscription of all, the remote city of Tonina, comes in the year 909. Curiously, the royal records before the fall of these cities offer little hint of impending catastrophe, writes David Drew. No codices survive with prophecies of doom, and there are few telltale signs of decline in Maya art, which remained vigorous until the end. All seem right with the word, then communication is lost and silence descends. And then at the the population of some Mayan cities had grown to be as dense as 800 people per square meter. Today, when we walk through the ruins of the spacious plazas and temples, it's hard to imagine that those overgrown terraces were once teeming with dense residential populations. But the urban populations were only the beginning. New search using LIDAR, a powerful laser scanning technology that can penetrate the three cover of the Mayan cities, has shown that settlement of the rural hinterlands was far more widespread and far denser than even the most outlandish previous estimates. It's now thought that in the 8th century the whole area would have supported a population of perhaps as many as 15 million. To put this in perspective, England around the same time had little more than 1 million people. The Mayan lowlands at this time in history were one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. With no significant animal sources of food and the population booming, even more land would need to be cleared for crops. The extent of which this deforestation contributed to the end of the classic Mayan civilization has been extensively debated, with many arguing that in that case have been overstated. The anthropologist Cameron McNeill points out that in many of these areas where the clear primary forests of the Maya seem to have cultivated orchards and plantation of crops like cacao, figs, star apples, tropical plums, cashews, and avocados. He further argues that although the ratio of unplanted herbs to trees indicates several episodes of heightened deforestation, none of these episodes correspond to the late classic period 600 to 900 CE, the time of the collapse. He goes on to conclude that the collapse of the ancient Maya cities may have been numerous causes in common, but deforestation was not among them. However, deforestation did significant was in one of the greatest threats that the Maya faced, that is the droughts that would often rock this region. The droughts were a fact of life in the water-poor environment of the Yucatan. In the 16th century, one Spanish observer recorded a drought in which such a famine fell upon them that they were reduced to eating the bark of trees. Nothing green was left. As we've seen, the most crucial role of Mayan infrastructure was to collect and store water to mitigate droughts. But every system has its limits, and towards the end of the Classic period, the Mayan faced a series of devastating climate shocks. In one surviving collection of Mayan texts and prophecies from the post-contact era, supposedly derived from a prophet Shilam named Balaam, you can always hear the echoes of some authentic memory of what this time must have been like. When our rulers increased in numbers, then they introduced the drought. That which came was drought, according to the words, when the hoofs of the animals burned, when the seashore burned, a sea of misery. So it was set on high, so it was set. Then the face of the sun was eaten, then the face of the sun was darkened, then its face was extinguished. They were terrified. On high. Whatever the cause of its series of drought, one thing we do know is that the loss of natural forest cover in its region will have greatly exacerbate them. The tree cover naturally increases the humidity of an environment with pores in the leaves, constantly releasing water through transpiration, as well as reducing evaporation by casting shade and slowing wind. Modern climate models estimate that the forested areas in Yucatan would have been much drier and experienced rainfall reduced of up to 20%. The productive forces that had once led to Mayan prosperity now turned against them, and with a growing population to feed, they were helpless to stop it. Mercury sulfide is insoluble in water, and as a toxin has been estimated to be many times weaker than liquid mercury, but in sufficient dosage it still builds up in the body's tissues over time, causing a wide range of chronic neurological and psychological effects. Following long-term use of cinnabar, renal dysfunction may occur. One study concludes, adding that studies of cinnabar suggest sedative and hypnotic effects. Perhaps even more dangerous than cinnabar, genetic studies have also found traces of blue-green algae called cyanobacteria known to produce deadly toxins in these same reservoirs. The main water sources for this side core of Tikal, especially the Temple and Palace Reserve, were seriously compromised as source of drinking water by the end of the late Classic period, one study author is right. This period of reduced rainfall occurred with expanded Tikal population when they were most reliant on water reserves. On site that has been particularly studied in the context of the main collapse in the city of Copan in the upland of what is now known western Honduras. Copuna was a small but very densely populated city, built in a narrow steep-sided river valley lined with pine forest. Its people loved sports. It had the largest ball court of any classic Mayan city, and it used the emblem of the leaf-nosed bat on its inscriptions. For much of its history, it was a close ally of Tikal and fought wars on its behalf. Copan was a trading post, perfectly positioned to profit from the obsidian, jade, and quetzal feathers that flowed down from the hills, and from the mining of cinnabar from caves in the Copan Valley. Copan was also seemingly an important site for either the production or importation of liquid mercury. Refined from cinnabar ore, this was potentially used for ritual of medicine purposes, but substantially more liquid mercury has been found at the site of Copan than at any other Mayan site. In the fertile alluvial silt of the valley floor, the local grew in abundance from the staples of maize, beans, and chilies. From the 5th century onward, fueled by his fertile soil and robust trade, the population of Copan boomed. By 800 CE, there had been as many as 30,000 people living in the small area of only about 25 square kilometers in the valley. Between the years 650 and 750, reconstruction of royal palaces and monuments were, especially Francis and lesser nobles, even began erecting their own palaces. This all points to a period of thriving economy. But the opulent lifestyle of the nobles had to be supported by the hard work of Copan's farmers. Analysis of skeleton remains from Copan paint a picture of inequality. From 650 onwards, signs of disease and malnutrition among Copan laboring residents increased. Their bones became porous and weak, and their teeth showed increased stress line. But you can't grow crops on a patch of soil endlessly. The Maya were responsible and knowledgeable farmers and had spent more than 2,000 years coaxing crops out of the thin soil of the Yucatan. They must have understood that soil needs to be given long fallow periods to restore its essential nutrients and minerals. But as the demands from the population increased, the rulers of the cities may have been ordered that the farmers to grow crops on the same soil again and again with no fallow periods allowed. It would have been a short-sighted strategy that could disaster in exchange for immediate gains. But at this point, the Mayan had little choice at that time. When times were hard, the common people would blame their rulers. The Mayan systems of rulership was based on an implicit promise: you support the king's lifestyles and he will protect you. He will keep the good happy, the rain falling and the crops growing. One part of the books of Chilam Balam of Chumien, called The Interrogation of the Chiefs Explicit, makes this connection between the king and the natural world. This is the first, and they said, this is the first question which will be asked of them. He shall ask them for his food, bring the sun. This is the word of the head chief to them. Thus it said to the chief, bring the sun, my son, buried on the palm of your hand to my plate. If the king was seen to break that promise, the people might have decided that he had to go. The Mayans warrior class, armed with throwing spears and oxygen-rich wooden bats called makuhuit, and armored only with padded cotton, must have maintained a shaky hold over a large and at times unruly population, and may have struggled to put down significant uprising. One enigmatic inscription at Copan, dated to 820 CE, says only the founder's house has been destroyed, suggesting that some form of dynastic change had occurred. By the mid-800s, Tikal was coming apart, and only 100 years earlier it had been at its height, and all its most impressive blood red temples and pyramids date from that time. But now its vital allies at Uhahu, and Jimbal were putting up a study of their own, declaring their independence from the imperial capital. When food became scarce, the cities at the center of the Mayan world, the city of Tikal, Caracol, and Calakmul, would have likely relied on their interconnected tributary networks to keep their citizens fed. A citizen the Ferries increasingly starved to feed their overlords. Resentment must have reached a fever pitch. Then the rulers of the land were called. Writer writes the prophet Balaam. The blood flowed, and it was taken by the archers. They were terrified. Instead of a centralized state, Tikal's domain was turning into a fractured mass of small kingdoms. What was worse, these minor kings often referred to themselves not only as independent but as the Holy Lord of Tikal, suggesting that it was not descending into civil war. By roughly 900, there was no longer a king in Tikal. The city fell into a chaos, and the grand buildings were abandoned by the ruling class. One by one, all the cities of the South mainlands were abandoned. Survivors of the catastrophe moved northwards, and sought refuge in coastal settlements like Tulum and Chichen Itza, where there were flourishing hybrid cultures with northern people like the Toltecs. But the former heartlands of the Mayan would never be reoccupied. In the early decades of the 19th century, the American writer, explorer, and diplomat John Lloyd Stephens and his artist companion Frederick Catherwood hacked their way through the dense tropical forests of the Yucatan Peninsula. They traveled for 2 weeks through the deep Guatemalan interior, following rumors that the ruins of an ancient city lay somewhere in the jungle. Their journey was difficult, beset by mosquitoes and the mud of the seasonal rains. But as they rounded a bend in the river, they came across a sight that few had laid eyes on over the last millennium: the top of a towering pyramid just visible above the trees. At this time, it was commonly believed that only civilization of the old world, like Greece and Rome, had built cities of such magnitude and elegance. Stephen and Catherwood would go on to explore more than 40 Mayan cities around the Yucatan Peninsula. And the books that Stevens wrote about this exploration, illustrated with Catherwood's detailed lithographs, caused a global sensation. And the more they explored of the Yucatan, the more Stephen became convinced that these cities had been built up over centuries, not by any visitors, but by an advanced society indigenous to the New World. So these were works of art, he wrote, proving that the people who once occupied the continent of America were not savages. Gradually, people began to accept that he was right, and the achievement of the ancient Mayan people were recognized. As they explored these ruined sites, Stephen wrote with haunting resonance about the ghostly melancholy of these ruins, silent beneath the shadows of the forest canopy. In one memorable passage, he leaves us with the image of one statue, standing with its altar before it, in a grave of trees which grew around it, seemingly to shade and shroud it as a sacred thing. The solemn stillness of the woods, it seemed a divinity mourning over a fallen people. The only sound that disturbed the quiet of these buried cities were the noise of monkeys moving among the tops of the trees, and with the strange monuments around us, they seemed like wandering spirits of the departed race guarding the ruins of the former habitations. Thank you. That's it. That's it for today. Thank you. And you will hear from me in the episode 3.